We have a new holiday on our hands in New Year's Eve. And to be more specific to us college football playoff fans, this holiday is college football playoff semifinal day. Michigan versus TCU takes place at 4, and Georgia versus Ohio State takes place at 8. Georgia versus the Buckeyes is the more anticipated matchup of the two. It's predicted to be the closer matchup of the two, and by power rankings, it is by quite a significant margin the biggest matchup of the two. In fact, according to ESPN's FPI, these are the two highest rated college football playoff teams and the most efficient playoff teams. I find the latter part of that, and actually both parts of it, actually somewhat comical, seeing what Michigan and Ohio State, when they faced off against each other, resulted in, and other different factors, of course. But it does make sense seeing that power rankings and efficiency really do factor in star talent, and Georgia and Ohio State, to their credit, have very much recruited better than Michigan and TCU. They have a lot more star talent on their hands. The stories for these two teams, both have achieved at a high level. Both are great teams. Both are teams that have very explosive offenses. Both teams also have high ceilings on defense, though Ohio State certainly also has that low floor on defense. Both of these teams are entertaining to watch. Both have great quarterback play. They don't have elite running back play, but they have still some of the better running backs in the country. And whereas Ohio State has their number one wide receiver core, Georgia has their number one tight end room. And this game right here, the Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl, Ohio State is 11-1. They're 4th in the country. Some don't think that they deserved a playoff spot. There are actually people that thought that a 2-loss USC or Alabama should be in ahead of Ohio State, though those people are few and far between. Ohio State's a team that I think is in wounded animal mode. With C.J. Stroud, with Mayan Williams, Cade Stover, Paris Johnson Jr., with Marvin Harrison on offense, and with Tommy Eichenberg, Steel Chambers, a healthy Mike Hall, JT Tuimoloau, and Jim Knowles at DC after having one of his worst games as a defensive coordinator in recent memory. This Ohio State team is ready to take on what is a second chance and a chance at redemption. This Georgia team is 13-0. They're the reigning national champions. They haven't lost a game since the SEC championship game last season. They're 15-0. That's their wins. That's their 15-game win streak since last year's college football playoff semifinal win over Michigan. Georgia has looked like the most dominant team in the country. They have been the most dominant team in the country since that Orange Bowl, and they're led by Kirby Smart and Glenn Schumann and Will Muschamp, and the very underrated offensive coordinator in Todd Monken have one of the best staffs in the country. Kirby Smart, if he wins the national title, Kirby Smart could make a case for not being the best coach of all time, for not being the best head coach if you factor in history, if you're biased toward the entire record or toward the past record of a coach. But if you have recency bias, if Kirby Smart repeats at 15-0, there could be an argument for him being the number one coach in the country, and for Georgia being what Alabama used to be and isn't at all this year. Alabama is not the Nick Saban Alabama that we've come to know and love or hate, depending on your opinion. With quarterback Stetson Bennett, Amarius Mims at offensive line, with Kendall Milton, Kenny McIntosh, Dejon Edwards, Darnell Washington, Brock Bowers, Adonai Mitchell, Marcus Rosemay, Jack Saint, Dylan Bell, with on defense Jalen Carter, Robert Beal, Christopher Smith, Malachi Starks, an offense and defense that at any moment, like a chainsaw, quick starting, burns fuel very quickly, but is quick, is deadly, makes precision cuts, and butchers anyone in their path. These two teams, while it is yet to be known if they are as efficient at developing talent as Michigan or TCU, it is known that they have some of the best talent in the country and some of the best staffs in the country. They have some of the biggest names in the country. Their programs, this is an arms race. This is the Soviet Union versus the United States. One team has one loss, a very bad home loss. I know that's Ohio State. The other team in Georgia hasn't been nearly as battle-tested. Georgia has not faced a team like Michigan or Ohio State or TCU, maybe TCU and Tennessee, but they still got them at home. Their strength of schedule, they're not as battle-tested as the Buckeyes, but they have that unblemished record. It's something that Ohio State certainly doesn't have. And I'm going to get into this preview, but before we do that, I encourage you all to hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, click the notification bell, comment your thoughts down below on this video and on what you think the score prediction will be. And if you're an Ohio State fan or a Michigan fan, support your team by purchasing my merchandise, which you can find in a link down below in my description, and wear your team colors and this channel's logo and support this channel and your team on its playoff run. And without further ado, let's talk about what might be one of the best semifinal games in playoff history. This game will take place on New Year's Eve, 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and it will air on ESPN. This is the night game. And this game, it's basically a Georgia home game. Let's be real here. Georgia fans travel well. SEC fans in general travel well. And it's in Atlanta. Ohio State fans travel very well. They might be the best traveling fan base in the country. And statistically, they're the largest fan base in the country by a mile. So Ohio State will have presence here. But believe me, it just being in Atlanta, it's so geographically close to Georgia that it will be closer to a Georgia home game than a neutral site game, but not a full Georgia home game. What might be the real kicker here is the FPI's percentage chance to win. When you think of Georgia matching up with Ohio State, you think of mental weakness with the Buckeyes against physical toughness and that chainsaw analogy that I used with Georgia. That's what most people would think. I'm not saying I think that way. We're not at the prediction yet. But a lot of people think that. ESPN's FPI thinks that this game will be close. They think that in 1,000 simulations, Georgia would only win 576 of them, which is still a lot, but it's not nearly as lopsided as the computers expect Michigan TCU to be, where Michigan is a much bigger favorite. It's the same with the spread. The Dogs are favored by 6.5 points. And Georgia is, look, Georgia's the better team. They have 2 more wins. They have no losses. Ohio State scores 44.5 points per game, which is nearly 5 more points. It actually is 5.3 more points than Georgia's 39.2 points per game. But Georgia has that undefeated record. They have the conference championship. Georgia's defense, for allowing a similar amount of yards per game as Ohio State's defense, allows 1 less touchdown. And when you look at some advanced analytics, which we will in a few minutes, some interesting stats like yards per play, points per play that I've collected, you see that Georgia's defense is just, it's top tier efficiency. It's different. And that's even the case in Georgia's offense. Like, Todd Monken is a play caller. There's a very strong argument that he's a better play caller than Ryan Day. There just is. I mean, the way Georgia butchers opponents alive is impressive. Now, Georgia has also had some pretty unimpressive games of their own, like against Kentucky, against Missouri, and LSU It was impressive for Georgia's offense. It was not impressive for their defense. But this game's expected to be the closest of the semifinal games. That is for sure. Offense, defense, by yards, these teams are very similar. They have a lot more passing yards per game than rushing yards per game. Ohio State in total gains 492.7 yards per game to Georgia's 491.9. It's not even 1 yard off. Ohio State allows 303.9 yards per game. And Georgia allows 292.1. Just a measly 11.8 yards between the two defenses allowed. And when it comes to passing, Ohio State passes for 294 a game, Georgia 285. Ohio State rushes for 199 per game, Georgia they rush for 207. The difference is in the defense and in the scoring too. They have the same amount of yards, but the way this offense and defense operates for both of these teams it's different. Georgia only allows 77 rushing yards per game. Ohio State allows 120. That's a pretty sizable difference. Georgia's secondary, meanwhile, allows 215.1 yards per game. Ohio State allows 184, which is interesting given the fact that we know that Georgia's corners especially are better than Ohio State's corners. Though I would like to add there's an argument that Ohio State's safeties are better than Georgia's safeties. But I do find that interesting, the difference in rushing yards and passing yards allowed between these two teams. You'd certainly expect Georgia to allow less rushing yards than Ohio State, but seeing Ohio State's secondary and how it struggled all year, part of me would expect Georgia's secondary to allow less yards. Granted, Georgia has faced Mississippi State, Tennessee, Oregon, LSU, teams that have a lot more talent in the passing department than any team Ohio State has faced all year, except for Michigan. Michigan is really the only team that Ohio State has faced all year outside of Maryland, and Maryland's been inconsistent at best there, that has an explosive offensive pass game that can do well and can succeed against high-level competition. Georgia's staff, as I've already mentioned, is one of the best in the country. I have to give them the staff edge here. On offense, their play calling is better in bigger games. Their defense, period, amen, allowing a touchdown less per game with similar yards and just being more efficient overall. And Kirby Smart having won a national title, recruits better. His players they're poised, they're disciplined, they are mentally tough. They've survived close games and pulled away late. And Georgia has been put through the mud, in some cases by their own doing in some of these SEC games, and they have not fallen short. They haven't. This staff is possibly the best in the country. And Ohio State staff is great. This Ohio State team, let's be real here, this is the best Ohio State team since 2019. And if you exclude that team, it might be the best Ohio State team since 2015 or 14. The difference is this Ohio State team put high pressure on themselves, high expectations, and they face the best Michigan team in 2.5 decades that's existed. And Michigan, frankly, matches up very well with Ohio State. College football's all about matchups. And Ohio State, and we'll get to this later, matches up better, I think, with Georgia than they do with Michigan. And part of that's because the quarterback advantage, the running back advantage, the wide receiver advantage. Skill positions. Ohio State is better at skill positions, except for tight end, which some don't even count as a skill position. They're vastly superior at skill positions compared to Georgia. You have an NFL quarterback in C.J. Stroud, who him and Stetson Bennett actually have some similar statistics overall. Stroud edges him in just about every category, except for the ground game. Stetson Bennett's a much more efficient scrambler and is willing to scramble unlike CJ Stroud, but Stroud's the superior passer. Stroud is thrown for 3,340 yards, 37 touchdowns, 6 picks. He has the third best QBR in the country with an 87.7, and he has a 176.2 passer rating. Stetson Bennett has thrown for 3,425 yards, 20 passing touchdowns, 6 interceptions. He has the sixth best QBR with an 86.2 and a 154.6 passer rating. Both of these quarterbacks, when it comes to passing the football, they have statistically regressed compared to last year. Part of that, I think, for Bennett is he's been used more. He doesn't have the same talented running back room or the same defense. They've had to rely on him more to win games. For Ohio State, I think part of it is the drop-off in wide receiver talent. I think part of it's that Ryan Day's wanted to run the ball more. He's been more stubborn with that. And I think that CJ Stroud he's still just as good as last year, but I think he's faced some tougher defenses and some tougher teams, if we're being honest here. Like Michigan and Penn State, both vastly improved compared to last year, offensively and defensively. I think the Big Ten East, this might be a controversial opinion, but I do think there are aspects of the Big Ten East that got tougher, at least from Ohio State's point of view and the offense that they want to run. At running back, I'm going to give the edge to Ohio State here. I think a healthy Mayan Williams, Dallin Hayden, Chip Trainum, and Xavier Johnson are actually better than Kendall Milton, Dejon Edwards, and Kenny McIntosh. It's very close, but I think Mayan Williams, when healthy, is one of the best running backs in the country. I don't know if I can say that for any of Georgia's running backs for sure. But the offensive line for Georgia will help Georgia's running backs look better, perform better. It'll hide some of their own foibles because there'll be more holes that are opened up. Georgia's offensive line, I think, will fairly push Ohio State's defensive line and linebacker core. They will give them a test similar to what Michigan gave them. At wide receiver, I think that's a no-brainer. It's why I sort of skipped it, but it's the same thing with tight end for Georgia. I think tight end favoring Georgia and wide receiver favoring Ohio State are the most no-brainer picks of who I think has the better spots on the roster. Stetson Bennett and CJ Stroud are actually more comparable than Cade Stover and Brock Bowers. They're more comparable than Marvin Harrison Jr. and Georgia's best wide receiver. Much more comparable. Defensive line, linebacker, defensive back, all positions on Georgia's defense, except for maybe safety, but overall, when you combine safety and corner into the defensive back position, I'm giving it, seriously, to Georgia here. Ohio State does not have a Christopher Smith or a Malachi Starks. They don't even have a guy built like Kelee Ringo in their secondary. Kelee Ringo, obviously, there's been talk around him from Georgia fans or Ohio State fans about how he could be a weak link at the corner position matched up against Ohio State's wide receivers, but he's built very well, and Christopher Smith is looked at as a first or second round pick at the safety position. I mean, Georgia's secondary, their linebacker core with Robert Beal and Jalen Carter, who's just insane on the interior. When he's in that rotation, you cannot run against Georgia. At least anyone who's Georgia has faced struggles to run against them with Jalen Carter in that lineup. It's just Georgia's defense and their trench play is at a whole different level than Ohio State's. But watch out for that skill position battle, because I am telling you, Ohio State's skill position, they have a matchup advantage, not just against Georgia's defense, but against Georgia's offense too. Ohio State's offense is engaged to do things that I don't know if Stetson Bennett and Georgia's offense are capable of consistently doing. But it's the same with Georgia's defense, and with Georgia themselves. I mean, Georgia's the physically tougher team. They're number one in efficiency in FPI. Ohio State, meanwhile, is third in FPI. They're second in efficiency. And Georgia's the nation's second most talented team, and Ohio State's the third most talented team. Compared to Michigan and TCU, you're seeing a lot closer. You're seeing a lot more equality, I guess how you could put it, when it comes to talent distribution, efficiency, when it comes to even the entire roster, when it comes to the talent distributed not just from star ranking, but like looking at the positions. Like, these teams have 5-star and 4-star offensive linemen. They have 5-star and 4-star quarterbacks. They have 5-star linebackers, both of them do. 5-star defensive linemen. I mean, talent is equally just distributed here for the most part. Georgia has it more than Ohio State does, but the gap isn't that big. And the strengths of these two teams, both of these teams, much like Michigan, unlike TCU, and unlike basically every other team in the country, are number one at something significant. Georgia's main strength is their number one rushing defense. No team allows less than 77 rushing yards per game. The team that allows 77 rushing yards per game is Georgia. They're number one in that category. Now, they haven't faced a team like Michigan, like Penn State, like Ohio State, even like USC or Utah. They have not faced teams that are great at running the football. They just haven't. They have not faced those teams. Oregon would probably be the best rushing offense that they faced, would be Oregon. But they dominated Oregon thoroughly. And we will see if they can do that against Ohio State here. But Georgia's, with Jalen Carter, I don't think there's a doubt this is the number one rushing defense in the country. For the Buckeyes, their main strength is that number one passing attack. Now, with Ryan Day at play caller and how he played in the Michigan game, like his play calling, you might argue that this passing attack under Ryan Day is not as efficient as it could be. And it is not number one. And there is an argument that Tennessee, with their full regular season roster, would have the number one passing attack. But name a team in the country that has the skill position talent of CJ Stroud, Marvin Harrison Jr., Emeka Egbuka, Julian Fleming, Mayan Williams, Xavier Johnson, Chip Trainum, Dallin Hayden. I mean, you can't. You can't. And I did mention the running backs because running backs can get involved in the passing game, and because Xavier Johnson is this Swiss Army knife on the offense. But they are number one in that passing attack, especially because of the guy named Marvin Harrison Jr., who, as far as I'm concerned, and as college football is concerned, because he was a unanimous All-American, is the best wide receiver in the nation, or one of. If not, he's just second to Jalen Hyatt. I mean, Marvin Harrison Jr. is a monster. He's like Jalen Carter, but as a wide receiver and not as a defensive tackle or a defensive lineman. He's a freak. He's a freak of nature. It's absolutely crazy. I mean, Marvin Harrison Jr., he has 1,157 receiving yards on 72 receptions and 12 receiving touchdowns. He averages 16.1 yards per reception. He's unreal. You match him up against a corner, he will beat that corner. You have to double cover him. And I imagine same thing with Jalen Carter. And I mean, that Georgia D-line, I'm a Michigan fan. I know what they did to my Joe Moore winning O-line last year. They manhandled them. That Georgia D-line, they're going to be hungry. And they're going to be playing 100% against one of the best O-lines in the country that Ohio State has. And that number one rushing defense, it doesn't match up perfectly with that number one passing attack. It doesn't. Georgia matches up better with Michigan than Ohio State does with Michigan. But also Ohio State matches up better with Georgia than Michigan does, and like all this other stuff, honestly. But that number one rushing defense, part of that's because just the presence at D-line and linebacker. And those guys, if they get through and they can, halt Ohio State's run game and they can penetrate, they can and will get pressure on CJ Stroud. And that will challenge that number one passing attack. It'll challenge how Stroud operates. That'll challenge how far the wide receivers can run down the field, how much time CJ Stroud has, and all these other different things. But that matchup in the trenches is going to be intriguing. And the efficiency of these two teams, the total talent they have, it is honestly going to purely come down to staff and play calling, especially on offense, because that's where the two teams are the closest. They're the most even when it comes to offense. Defense leans toward Georgia, offense leans toward Ohio State, but with Todd Monken and the talent they have there, and if you've watched Georgia all year, you know that in big games, this offense comes alive. It comes alive. For the players to watch, I look at Stetson Bennett for Georgia, quarterback, who has been the starter in 2020, in 2021, and this year has been the starter since day one, no questions about it. I also look at defensive end JT Tuimoloau, which is an interesting decision for my player to watch. And that's because I think that Ohio State, something that's changed in my mind, is that Ohio State can't just engage in a shootout and win. Because even though Stetson Bennett has statistically regressed, they've had to rely on him more than they did last year. Stetson Bennett has over 100 more passing attempts than last year. He completes 4% more of his passes. He's been sacked less times. He also has 6 more rushing touchdowns. He's a better scrambler overall. And he's thrown for, almost 600 more yards. He's become more reliable. Todd Monken is using this offense correctly. And with Brock Bowers and Darnell Washington, Georgia can more comfortably engage in a shootout with the physical kind of pro-style spread they like to play, not like the air raid model that killed them last year when they faced Bryce Young, Jameson Williams, and John Mechie in that SEC title. I think Georgia is more prepped. I think this offense for Georgia is more prepped to engage in a shootout than last year's offense. That's just my opinion. It might be wrong. At the same time, their defense isn't as strong as last year's unit. It's not as loaded. But for Ohio State, their defense, especially JT Tuimoloau, they're going to have to play in a way that they didn't play outside of that Penn State game, especially the D-line. They are going to have to just play some insane level of football. Stetson Bennett, let's get back to him and then I'll get to JT Tuimoloau. Stetson Bennett, he went to the Heisman ceremony. He's passed for 3,425 yards, a 154.6 passer rating. I've already went over this, so I'm not going to go over it too much, but I'm just going to say he has a good arm. He can scramble. He is deceptive as a player. He deceives you. You think because he's not, he doesn't have this NFL build or because he's a walk-on, you think he isn't a good player. And this is heresy. These are lies. I've watched him scramble. I've watched him throw. He's intelligent with his playmaking and with his scrambling. He can throw on the run. He can throw off his back foot. He can throw while falling down. He is willing to make contact to get extra yards. He will accelerate and deaccelerate, and he can juke. And he has a deep ball that is as accurate as anyone in the country. So watch out for Stetson Bennett against those Ohio State corners. And for Ohio State's D-line, with Mike Hall back, I could have put Mike Hall up here because he has been a force when healthy in the interior. But JT Tuimoloau, I just want to talk about him for a few seconds here. He only has 3.5 sacks, 1 forced fumble, 2 interceptions, 16 solo tackles, and a total tackle amount of 28. And 2 passes defended as well, and one of the picks was returned for 6. Against Penn State, he had 2 picks, 1 returned for 6, a pass deflection, a forced fumble and fumble recovery, and he had 2 sacks in that game. Listen, JT Tuimoloau, if he can come alive, and I know that, he's facing an O-line like he faced against Michigan, where he didn't get a single sack or pick or fumble, didn't really get anything against Michigan in that game. But if he can come alive, and the D-line can come alive, the player of the game, I picked Tuimoloau because he has the highest upside of any of the D-linemen, but it's really Ohio State's D-line. Watch out for them. I'm very curious to see what they do against Georgia's O-line. If they've learned any lessons from Michigan, I'm curious to see about Ohio State's defense too. If they try and use the same strategy they did against Michigan, bringing 0 blitzes, sending the house, or if they're going to be more conservative and not as ultra aggressive, which did cost them in that Michigan game. My prediction, I think that this game is going to be one of the best semifinal games ever. I think that Georgia's going to win 35-33. I think that Ohio State will fail on a 2-point conversion. Or, alternatively, Ohio State will just fall barely short by either a late Georgia score, a failed 4th down. Ohio State will fall short late. This game will not be over until the clock hits 0. Georgia's physicality will win them this game. Their running backs will have over 200 rushing yards and 2 or more rushing touchdowns. Quarterback Stetson Bennett will have 2 passes of 40 yards or more. And Georgia's passing attack, their running attack, their offense will be on fire. I don't think Ohio State's D-line is going to stop them in the trenches. I don't think Ohio State's defense, period, will stop them. I could be wrong. Ohio State's defense, unlike last year, they do have this high upside to them where I do think this defense can limit any offense in the country. But unlike Georgia's and Michigan's defense, it isn't as proven. And they have a much lower floor than both of those defenses do. So just evening out the ceiling and the floor, finding that average, the median, the mean, whatever you want to call it, Georgia should handily hang points on this defense and have some explosive plays. But I think that with the matchup that's been presented by Ohio State against Georgia, by the fact that Georgia hasn't faced an offensive line as good as Ohio State's all year, or a wide receiver core, or a quarterback, or even a running back as good as Mayan Williams, every position, except for maybe tight end, and part of that is my, don't know exactly how good Ohio State's tight end room is compared to the rest of the country. I think that, there's a great chance that Tennessee and, South Carolina, I'd say, South Carolina has a better tight end room than Ohio State with Jaheim Bell. But the skill position and the trench players that Georgia's facing on Ohio State's offense, except for, again, tight end, they haven't seen anywhere all year. And I think that will give C.J. Stroud a huge opportunity to rack up yards and touchdown passes. Think of this game this way, except it will be more even, not as extreme. It will be 2013 Johnny Manziel versus Alabama. Ohio State here has an opportunity to jump out to a double-digit lead early with the matchup presented here. You have a good quarterback with a good arm. You have wide receivers who will match up well with Georgia's corners and with their safeties. You will just listen. You have guys for Ohio State at wide receiver. And listen, Georgia, you have guys at secondary. Your safety room, it's one of the better safety rooms in the country. Same with Ohio State's. The problem, of course, is, ironically for both of the teams, the problem is corner. Keely Ringo for Georgia, luckily it's just one player. For Ohio State, it's both. It's both corners. No matter who they put in at corner, they can't do it. And that's why I think there will be big plays through the air for both of these teams. Ohio State will outgain Georgia in total yards. to. The 33 would be 34 if they kicked an extra point, which implies that Ohio State will score. They'll score 4 touchdowns, 2 field goals. Georgia will score 5 touchdowns. I think that Ohio State will get more red zone trips. They'll get more first downs. Heck, they might even have more time of possession. But they had all those things, except for more yards, in that Michigan game. They had more TOP. They had more first downs. And yet, Michigan won because Michigan's offense was more efficient. They called the better plays because Michigan's defense was better and played a bend-but-don't-break game that worked very well. Georgia has as many, if not more, resources in all those departments compared to Michigan. So I think that even though Ohio State has the better offense, Georgia overall is the better team, and they have the better staff. And the defense and staff for Ohio State will be the root of defeat. Ryan Day has proven himself to be too conservative or too aggressive in big games. He isn't balanced enough in big games. And I don't know if it's nerves. I don't know if it's the fact that he's still learning as a head coach. I don't know what it is. But I trust Georgia more. And even though I love Ohio State in this matchup. This matchup screams Buckeyes, I think. But matchups are only part of it. On the field matchups, at least, because the off the field matchups and the on the sidelines matchups favor Georgia. Kirby Smart's a better head coach than Ryan Day is. Todd Monken might be a better play caller than Ryan Day is. And Georgia's defense is much better than Ohio State's defense. Georgia's defense is in like a whole other universe compared to 98% of college football teams. So I think this is going to be a fantastic semifinal. I think, much like the computers, this game is closer to a toss-up than not. I expect Ohio State to cover. That's not a given, but I expect Ohio State to cover regardless if they win or lose. But I would take Georgia to win in this game. And that's all I have to say in this video. If you liked it, make sure to hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, click the notification bell. Please check out my merchandise store down in the description below and comment your thoughts on this video and on my prediction. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you all around. Bye-bye.